Hi, everybody. This is Peter Schiff, and I wanted to take some time out to record my official response to the unsubstantiated and completely false allegations that were leveled against my bank and against me personally by the Australian media. In particularly Australia 60 Minutes, which was a broadcast piece about me and the bank that was aired on local Australian television, along with a companion article that was published by The Age. Now, both of these outlets are owned by Fairfax Media. And Fairfax Media is the second largest media company in Australia next to News Corp. They are their left-wing rival. They're like the U.S. equivalent of maybe MSNBC, whereas News Corp is Fox News. And so I have already retained a law firm in Australia, Kennedy's, which is one of the top law firms in Australia with experience in high-profile defamation cases. In fact, they've actually successfully sued Fairfax Media and Nick McKenzie, who was the guy that was interviewing me in the past. And so hopefully we're going to successfully sue them again, particularly with respect to the fraudulent nature with which they obtained the interview and all of the defamatory statements, unsubstantiated, untrue statements that were leveled against me throughout that hit piece. So the first step is that we are reaching out to Fairfax Media, and I will give them a chance to retract the story, apologize to me, fire McKenzie, and release the unedited, uncut version of the interview that they fraudulently conducted with me. Now, if they agree to all that, then I won't press my defamation lawsuit. But if they do not do that, then the suit goes on and I will win. I mean, they could do whatever they want to drag this out, but they have no case. They have no evidence to support any of the false allegations they made. But let me backtrack and get into everything that they did, starting with that fraudulently obtained interview that is basically the crux of the whole story that took place in my house. Oh, and by the way, after these story broke, there's been all sorts of other stories. One of the most recent was in the New York Times, but there are all sorts of articles that have been written in other publications basically building on or embellishing some of the false statements that were made by the Australian companies. So this whole thing is snowballing, and the court of public opinion has already convicted me of a crime that not only haven't I committed, but I haven't even been charged with. But let's go back to the beginning, this interview. So a reporter named Charlotte Grieve. Charlotte reached out to me via Schiff Radio. She sent an email and she said, hey, I stumbled across Peter Schiff's information online and we're really interested in his views on gold and inflation. So could we interview him, right, to talk about gold and inflation and stuff like that? And this request did not seem out of the ordinary to me because I get a lot of requests from international media to interview me. So I didn't think anything of it. We agreed to the interview. Ms. Greaves wrote that she was going to be the one that was going to be interviewing me, but she had a colleague, Nick McKenzie, who may or may not sit in, not participate, but sit in. And depending on my schedule, this guy may sit in, right? Now, this whole thing was a trap. It was a lie from the beginning. They had no interest in my views on gold or inflation. They didn't even really ask me about that. The sole purpose of the interview was Euro Pacific Bank. But had they told me that they wanted to interview me about the bank, I probably wouldn't have agreed to the interview. So they knew they had to lie. In fact, that's why they disguised who was going to be doing the interview, because this Nick guy is an investigative journalist. And that might have, caused me to be suspicious. Why is this the guy that wants to interview me? So they disguised the fact. He didn't just sit in. He was the only one that I talked to. Charlotte Grieve wasn't even there, right? So, number one, they got me to do this interview completely based on fraud, right? Had they been honest with me and they knew that, there would have never been an interview. Now, so here I am at my house, and the cameraman shows up, who they had hired, a local guy, to set up the cameras in the foyer of my Connecticut home. And before we actually did the interview, the camera guy said, hey, they want me to get some B-roll. And B-roll is just footage to kind of embellish the story, to make it interesting. And they said they wanted to get me kind of working, behind a desk at my home office. And I said, all right, yeah, that sounds reasonable. But I was actually working at the time because he was doing some setup. And I said, look, is this just going to be video? I don't want any audio. And he said, oh yeah, no, we're not going to record you. We're just filming you so we have some images. So don't worry, you can talk because we're not recording you. And I believed him. Of course, it was a lie because they actually used part of a conversation that they claimed they weren't even recording. And they just pulled something out of it that kind of made me look a little bad.
So if we just settle it now for $5,000.
I mean, it wasn't bad, but the point was they lied to me. But also, had they done the interview first, I never would have agreed to the B-roll. Because if you look at the way they used those images, they were trying to claim that I was running the bank from my office. Not only running the bank, but that I was masterminding the largest global money laundering tax evasion scheme in the history of the world.
The man at the center of it all, the face of the bank, Peter Schiff.
Even though I had told them that I don't even work at the bank. I have no title, I have no official duties, I draw no salary, I'm not involved in the daily operations. So I'm not even masterminding the bank, let alone a criminal enterprise. But they tried to use this footage to say that, I'm pulling all the strings from my house in Weston. So they filmed this. Then I sit down on a chair in my foyer for the interview, which at that point I still believe is going to be about gold, inflation, the economy.
But when he sat down for an interview, the last thing he wanted to talk about was the offshore bank he co-owns in the Caribbean.
Of course, the last thing I wanted to talk about was the bank, because they told me they wanted to talk to me about gold and inflation, not the bank. But gold and inflation were the last things that Nick McKenzie wanted to talk about. So it was McKenzie, not me, who went off topic, but then he used my desire to stay on topic and discuss only what I was told would be discussed to falsely imply that I had something to hide. And so I'm sitting down, and the first couple of questions are close to that topic, but more background on me, and I'm like, all right, this is okay. But then all of a sudden, they asked me a question about my bank. And, yeah, I have a bank, and, I asked them a few questions, and they asked me a few more questions, and I answered them. And so initially, I'm very polite early on about the bank, but then they just keep giving me more questions on the bank. And then I kept saying, well, why are you asking me these questions about the bank? I mean, you didn't say that you wanted to discuss the bank in your email. You said you wanted to discuss inflation and gold. So why don't we have that discussion? Because I really can't say much about the bank because, I'm an owner, but I just don't have anything to do with the daily operations. So if you really want to discuss the bank, call the bank. Talk to someone at the bank. I'm just not the right guy. Let's just proceed with the interview that you requested and the one that I agreed to. But then they kept asking me questions about the bank. And it wasn't so much asking me questions. They were basically accusing the bank of doing all this bad stuff, right? Of being the target of this investigation, of facilitating tax evasion and money laundering. And, I kept denying that, saying, this isn't true. I don't know what you're talking about, right? We're not the subject of anything. I told them flat out that no country, no authority in any jurisdiction had ever come to the bank and told me or anyone at the bank that we were the target of anything, that we were being investigated for anything. I said, that's not true. So wherever you're hearing these rumors, there's no truth to them. They are completely false. But then they kept on asking me questions. In fact, in many cases, they just asked me the same question that I'd already answered over and over again. I mean, maybe they slightly tweaked it, but they kept asking. So now I'm getting very agitated because now it's becoming clear that they lied to me, that they defrauded me, that they had no intention of interviewing me on the economy or gold or inflation or anything else, that it was really a trap that they had laid to ambush me with all these false allegations against my bank. So then I start getting upset. Hey, stop asking these questions. I'm not talking about it. And then they keep pushing on to the point where I eventually say, look, if you're not going to ask me real questions about the economy or anything, if all you're going to talk about is my bank and accuse me of stuff that's untrue and that is unsubstantiated, because I kept asking them, if you have any evidence that I've done anything wrong, show it to me. They had nothing. All they could do is level unsubstantiated charges at me. And so eventually I said, look, the interview is over. This is clear. And I took off my microphone and got up and left. And of course, that then became the focus of the interview, was the fact that I stormed out of it. Of course I stormed out of it. Who wouldn't? I talked to them for almost an hour. Now, as soon as the interview was over, I contacted the producer and I said, this is completely unethical. I do not give you permission to use any of this footage. I said, I did not sign a release, which apparently I found out in Australia you don't need. But they had obtained the interview under false pretenses. Supposedly, I consented to a release by sitting down for the interview, but I was induced to sit down for that interview based on fraud. So I said, hey, this is not what you told me you were going to interview me about. Therefore, I don't want you to use any of this information. I do not give you my permission. If you thought you had consent, I withdraw it. They ignored that. I also said to them, if you use any of this interview out of context, you had better provide me with the raw, unedited footage. In fact, I demanded that as a condition of potentially giving them my permission to use it. Well, I want to get the footage in case you try to make me look bad. They denied to give me the footage because that is exactly what they've done. When I rewatch the interview, I can tell, right, that some of the answers that I am giving are not directly responsive to the questions they show answering, right? What they are doing is they were piecing through all the questions and all the answers to take the parts of the answers that would make me look the worst, right, and ignore the ones that would make me look better. So it was a complete and total hatchet job, which is one of the reasons that I am demanding that they release the unedited footage, because it makes them look horrible. I mean, you see how I go from being very polite and very respectful to getting increasingly more agitated as they continue to level false, unsubstantiated charges against me, and I answer the question and I ask them to move on, and they refuse to do it. And I remind them in that interview that they lied to me to get me to agree to it. They never denied that. They don't say we didn't lie to you. They can't, because the evidence is clear. So anybody, too, who is watching this should demand that 60 Minutes Australia release the footage. I mean, how much? What does it cost them? Nothing. They have it. They shot it. Put it up on their website. They don't want to put it up on their website? Send it to me. I'll put it up on my website. Big deal. If they fairly presented the interview, then what are they afraid of? Right? What they don't want the world to see is that this is not journalism, right? This is a hatchet job. They were not interested in presenting the truth. They didn't give a damn about the truth. They had a lie that they wanted to tell, and they told it, right? Because it's good for their own ratings, and because maybe they don't like me, right? Maybe because I'm a free market guy, a conservative, libertarian. They don't like me. They're a left-leaning publication, and they want to take me down, right? They don't care about the truth. This was a hit piece on me. And if you watch the entire interview, that alone will prove it, which is why they don't want to release it. In fact, they made a big deal about how my guard was down during the interview. Well, if it was down, it was only down because they purposely tricked me into lowering it by lying to me. Anybody would have reacted the way I did in the circumstances that I was under, except they don't show you everything that led up to me taking my mic off and storming out. In fact, to make matters worse, they focused on my wife. They said he left the last word to his wife, which I did not do. But yes, after I walked out, my wife, basically, who was in, the house, who heard the whole thing go down and was so disgusted at the way they were treating me, basically wanted to talk to the reporter about, like, why did you just do this? I mean, what was the whole purpose of this? So she sat down, not thinking she was actually being filmed for the interview. And then they ended up using my wife to try to make me look even worse, as if I ran away and left my wife to fight my battles. I didn't run away from anything, and my wife didn't try to fight anything. She had a question. She had no reason to believe that she would become part of the story or that they would use her image, because she just sat down there to talk to the guy, not to participate in the interview. But that shows you how low they're willing to sink in order to try to discredit me. Also, kind of to make it worse, when you watch the 60-minute piece, you'll notice the background music. It's this ominous, America's Most Wanted type music. Like, okay, we've really busted this case wide open, right? We've caught this criminal red-handed doing all this bad stuff. When I haven't done anything. I have not been accused by anybody of doing anything wrong. I started Euro Pacific Bank in 2011. We've had many, many audits. We've had government audits. We've had independent audits. We hire our own independent major accounting firm to audit our AML procedures. Never had a problem. Right? Everything is fine at my bank. I told the reporters, I don't even know what you're talking about. Our compliance is above and beyond, that we turn down more accounts than we approve, and we close accounts routinely if there's any kind of red flag that gets waved after the account has been opened. But they completely continued to make these false allegations that my bank was facilitating money laundering, right? That I was actually out there marketing tax avoidance as a reason to open up an account for your Pacific Bank. And I said, we don't do that at all. Show me where we do that. Where on my website do we do that? Show me one marketing piece. They have no information. They have no evidence, because we don't do it. We don't encourage people not to pay their taxes. In fact, one of the questions that we make people certified to before they open up an account is that they are compliant with all their local tax laws. We go out of our way to make sure that people are not using our account to help avoid their taxes by asking them to certify to us that they're not doing that, right? But they tried to create the false impression that the reason that I moved my bank to Puerto Rico, right, from St. Vincent's, was because Puerto Rico had all this privacy, bank secrecy, and that's what my tax evading clients needed, was this bank secrecy. And so in order to make my bank more attractive to people that wanted to hide their money, I moved it to Puerto Rico.
Peter Schiff located the bank he co-owns, Euro Pacific, in Puerto Rico, partly because he knew it offered the kind of secrecy his clients wanted.
And I pointed out to these guys the absurdity of such a contention. Because number one, Puerto Rico does not have bank secrecy, but St. Vincent's does. See, when I was in St. Vincent, customers of my bank did enjoy bank secrecy and a private account. When I moved the bank to Puerto Rico in 2017, all of that was lost. But it didn't matter to me that I gave that feature up, because that feature was not important to my business model. We were not marketing the bank as being a private account. Now, that was the case for the first couple of years, but we quickly went in a different direction because we saw that there was a lot of regulatory scrutiny. All of a sudden, it became, private or secret, became like four-letter words in the banking community. So we made a decision early on our own. We do not want to advocate this. We don't want to market it. So even though the accounts did enjoy that benefit, we no longer made it a something that we highlighted on any of our literature on our website. In fact, speaking of the website, when I told this guy McKenzie that I don't work for the bank, so a lot of these specific questions should be directed to people who are actually working at the bank. He said, well, you're the face of the bank. Your name and your likeness are all over the website.
The bank uses you as its key piece of marketing, though.
I said, no, they're not. I said, have you even gone to my bank's website? My name does not appear on that website anywhere. There's not a single picture of me on my bank's website. He was probably confusing my bank's website with maybe Europe Pacific Asset Management or Schiff Gold or something like that. But he did all this research about my bank, and he never even went to my website. And in fact, if he did go to our website, he would have actually seen all of the requirements for opening up an account and how strict we are, and the fact that we don't do anything to encourage tax avoidance. But anyway, they were making these false allegations that we were banking all of these nefarious people, right? That we had very lax standards, and as a result of that, we had all of these bad characters that had accounts at my bank. There was one main person that was featured in the 60-minute story, right? This bad guy that had an account at my bank. They said he was a convicted drug trafficker, and he had an account at my bank. Right? This guy actually reached out to me because he wants to file a lawsuit too. So I spoke to him on the phone, and I confirmed his identity based on his passport. And I asked him, I said, well, are you a convicted drug trafficker? He said, no, never. And I said, well, do you have any drug history in your past? And he said, as a matter of fact, when I was 24, there was a drug infraction, there was a suspended sentence, and that was it, right? I said, did you go to jail? No, they suspended the sentence. Nothing really happened. I asked him how old he is now. He's basically, I think, 48. So 24 years ago, as a kid, he got busted for something related to drugs, and they suspended the sentence. That was it. Actually, several days later, I had another discussion with Darby. And during that conversation, he said that it is possible that he was technically convicted of drug trafficking. That's because in Australia, the crime of drug trafficking is defined very broadly. So while it does include crimes of a serious nature, those which would typically be associated with actual drug trafficking, it can also include minor infractions, such as simply buying a small quantity of drugs for a friend. The fact that Darby's sentence was suspended with no time served does suggest that whatever he did do, it was on the minor side of the spectrum. Plus, Nick McKenzie was trying to create the false impression that Darby was still trafficking drugs and that he was doing so with the help of my bank. Not that he had received a suspended sentence 20 years before he even opened an account at my bank. Also, he didn't even have an account at my bank anymore. He had an account at my bank. It was closed in early 2017 before we moved to Puerto Rico and before this supposed investigation even began. Now, his account got closed because of some red flag that was waved. Not that this guy did anything wrong. We have no idea if he did anything wrong, but apparently something happened. Some article mentioned him in some potential unfavorable manner, and that was all it took for us to close his account. I mean, it is not only very difficult to get an account at Europe Pacific Bank, but a lot of times the accounts get closed, even though you've done nothing wrong. You know, I get sometimes too, I get people who have been turned down for an account or whose account has been closed and they've been customers for years. And sometimes they'll reach out to me. Now, they can't even reach out to me through the bank because I don't even have an email address. But they track me down. They email me at, at Europe Pacific Capital or something like that. And they make a plea. They say, hey, Peter, I'm a good guy. I don't know what's going on, but my account got turned down or it got closed. You know, I'm not doing anything wrong. Can you do something? Can you put in a good word for me? And every time this happens, I reply, I can't do anything for you. My hands are tied. I can't override a decision that is made by the compliance department. They are separate and they have the final say. I said, if I were to intervene on behalf of somebody to try to get compliance to override a decision they made to shut down an account or deny an account, that would make the bank look bad. I said, I can't do that. So I don't interfere with compliance. If you got turned down, they had a reason, And unfortunately, that's that. I mean, most likely their concerns were not necessarily genuine, but that's not the problem. It's not whether or not you did something wrong, whether or not there is the potential that you might have done something wrong based on a red flag that might have been waved. And if that's waved, that's it. No questions asked. We can't afford to take the chance of having, a bad person having a bank account, which is why so few do. But anyway, this bank, again, was saying, or the report was that Euro Pacific Capital is a bad bank because we have this guy's account and he's this convicted drug trafficker. Well, he's not, and his account was closed by my bank, right? Not by him. We closed it, right? Doesn't that show that we're a good bank? We looked at some problem. See, they're trying to claim that we look the other way at problems. We don't. We focus in on every problem. And if anything looks suspicious, we immediately close the account. Of course, we won't even open the account if there's something that looks suspicious initially. But sometimes people open up an account and there's nothing suspicious about the account. It doesn't become suspicious until they use the account for some suspicious purpose, and then we immediately shut it down. But the other fact about this guy is that 60 Minutes was claiming he was Australian, right? He was one of these 100 so bad Australians, right, that we were banking that was evading their taxes. So supposedly this was a drug smuggler, trafficker, tax evader living in Australia. Except he told me he moved out of Australia in 2003 and he hasn't lived there since. He lives in Dubai, not Australia. And Dubai doesn't have an income tax. So not only is this guy not a drug trafficker, he's not a tax evader because he has no taxes to evade. So he was the major focus of the whole piece. And, you can see in the interview, Nick McKenzie specifically asked this, expert, what does it say about Euro Pacific Bank if they would open up an account for a convicted drug trafficker?
The fact that multiple crooks, people with recorded criminal convictions for serious offending, have bank accounts at Euro Pacific Bank, what does it say about the bank's compliance culture?
Right? And then he says, well, that shows that they obviously have no compliance.
It suggests that perhaps they were waving customers through without actually really considering the risk that those customers were going to be placing proceeds of crime in the accounts that they were opening.
Actually, the only thing it does suggest is that Nick McKenzie has a friend in the government who's been leaking him classified information. Information that neither my bank nor any other bank would have access to. That's because any crime that was committed more than 10 years in the past without a repeat offense is classified as being a spent crime. If a crime is spent, all records of the offense are purged and are no longer accessible to the public. That would include my bank as well as every other bank that Darby has had accounts with during the past 14 years, including the major banks he has accounts with now. Since it was technically impossible for my bank to have known about Darby's spent conviction, the fact that we opened his account in no way impugns our compliance procedures or in any way suggests that we were waving customers through. In fact, my guess is that Nick McKenzie never even disclosed this important fact when asking his hypothetical question. Had he done so, he would have received a very different answer. The bottom line is that if my bank really was opening accounts for people with serious criminal records, Nick McKenzie would have been able to come up with a much better example than Darby. In fact, they did come up with another example of a criminal who banked with Euro Pacific, Simon Acatel. Except this example actually proves just how good my bank's compliance department is.
It's as simple as it is irresistible for tax avoiders like Simon Acatel. International enforcement sources have told 60 Minutes he was one of the Australians using Euro Pacific. From 2014 to 2017, Acatel engineered the biggest tax scam in recent Australian history, ripping off more than $100 million.
Acatel opened his account with Euro Pacific Bank in March of 2015. But of course, at that time, he didn't have a criminal record yet, so my bank would have had no reason to have rejected his application. Now, over the next 16 months, he did a total of 15 small transactions, not a single one exceeding $10,000 in value. However, his account was then frozen by my compliance department due to the suspicious nature of one of those transactions. He was then unable to provide an adequate explanation or provide documentation to support the legitimacy of that transaction. So his account remained frozen until it was eventually closed in January of 2018, almost 2 years before he pled guilty to a crime. While Alcatel may have engineered the biggest tax scam in Australian history, ripping off $100 million before Australian authorities finally busted him, he was actually no match for my bank's compliance department. We shut him down after less than just $75,000 in total transactions. So my bank clearly did nothing to facilitate his crimes. On the contrary, if more banks had acted as responsibly as mine, perhaps a lot less money would have been stolen. So both of the individuals they hold out as being examples of my bank's lack of compliance actually had their accounts closed by my bank's compliance department for red flags or suspicious activity. So their own examples prove their entire case against my bank is a fraud. So the whole thing is a smear campaign. In fact, every single person they interviewed who was saying all this negative stuff about Euro Pacific Bank, the one person who never mentioned Euro Pacific Bank was the guy they interviewed from the Australian government, right? He didn't mention Euro Pacific Bank once. He didn't say that my bank was under investigation. He didn't mention what bank was under investigation. 60 Minutes just guessed that the bank was mine, right? Even though there's no evidence that that's the case. Look, even if one of these countries is investigating the bank, which they haven't told me they're investigating the bank, but let's say they are. What does that mean? I mean, maybe it's possible that because a number of people were evading taxes, although clearly this guy that lives in Dubai, is not one of them. Maybe he was on the list, but he's clearly not a tax evader because he doesn't even live in Australia. But let's say there are a few people who have not paid their taxes and who do have accounts at my bank. It's certainly possible that that made my bank look a little suspicious to some of these regulators, and so they opened up an investigation because they want to find out if my bank is in any way complicit or aiding and abetting in the tax evasion, which is fine with me. They can investigate my bank all they want because they're not going to find anything. But maybe they are investigating it, but they're not doing it in a way where I'm cooperating because they haven't told me I'm being investigated. Nobody from Australia has told me that I'm under investigation. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm not. But look, police investigate crimes all the time. They never file any charges. They don't release the information on the people they're investigating because they don't want to taint them with a false allegation of something that's not true. But a lot of people think that just because I'm being investigated for something, I must be guilty. No, you're not guilty until there's a conviction. But I'm not even at that point. They haven't even found enough evidence to charge me with anything, let alone convict me of something. Yet 60 Minutes Australia and The Age, they've already tried and convicted me. I'm already guilty. They're so far ahead of the investigators, even if they are investigating me. Also, with respect to my decision to move the bank to Puerto Rico, which in and of itself disproves their claim that I did it to make it easier for people to hide their money with bank secrecy, because I actually moved out of a jurisdiction that had very strong bank secrecy to a one that really didn't, right? I'm in a U.S. jurisdiction now in Puerto Rico when we were in St. Vincent's, but I told the reporters the actual reasons for the move, right? One of the reasons was because I personally had already moved to Puerto Rico. And by living in Puerto Rico, I have favorable tax rates on any businesses that I also operate out of Puerto Rico. That is why I moved my asset management company, Euro Pacific Asset Management, from California in 2013 to Puerto Rico, right? That had nothing to do with helping clients evade their taxes. I moved that business to Puerto Rico to reduce my own taxes, not my clients' taxes. That's the same thing with the bank. None of my customers enjoyed any tax benefits of the move to Puerto Rico. The only tax benefits were to the owners of the bank who live in Puerto Rico, which includes me and the bank's president and vice president, who also moved to Puerto Rico, right? The other point that I made with 60 Minutes was that we wanted to get out of the tax haven jurisdictions. We didn't want that stigma because it was becoming increasingly more difficult to work as a bank in tax havens. So we were told that Puerto Rico would have a different reputation as being part of the United States. And so we moved to Puerto Rico, and that did help. That did open up many doors that were previously closed to us when we were working in St. Vincent's. So that was a legitimate business reason that we moved the bank to Puerto Rico, having nothing to do with making it easier for people to avoid taxes, because it actually accomplished the opposite. It actually made it more difficult because we moved from a jurisdiction that had very strict bank secrecy to a jurisdiction that did not. You know, a big part of the story ended up being about me personally and about what a bad guy I am. And I think the reason that they went down that tangent is because they found no real evidence against the bank itself. So they wanted to make it about me. And basically, they went into my background. They went into my father's background, and they said, oh, you know, Peter Schiff's father was a tax protester. He was convicted of tax evasion. He died in prison. And so he was a bad guy that didn't pay taxes. Peter Schiff is a vocal critic of big government and taxes. Given his background and given those opinions, well, it's obvious that he would be marketing himself as a way to avoid taxes. And clearly, if his dad didn't pay his taxes and he doesn't like paying taxes, he's obviously helping other people not pay their taxes. None of that is true, though. It doesn't matter. Just because my father didn't pay taxes doesn't mean that I'm involved in a scheme to enable others to not pay their taxes. Look, I have no criminal record personally. Anything. I don't have any tax problems. I don't have any other problems. So regardless of the sins of my father, you don't visit those sins on me. In fact, I've gone out of my way on my podcast to tell people, even the people that read my father's books, not to take his advice, right? Not to be tax protesters, to pay the taxes. I've said if you want to move to Puerto Rico to reduce your taxes, fine. That's totally legitimate. But I have always discouraged people from following my father's advice, and I have never followed my father's advice myself. So for them to say that I'm a bad guy, one guy said that I fly outside the rules or whatever, I break the law.
Peter Schiff's a character who likes to fly outside the rules a little.
Based on what evidence is he saying that? Based on nothing, right? This is all conjecture and speculation. They have no real evidence that says that I ever do anything that is illegal or even borders on being illegal. Now, one of the allegations that they leveled against me during the interview, and they had the guy saying this too in the 60 Minutes piece. They said, why would anybody want to have an offshore account? I mean, why would somebody in Australia have a bank account in Puerto Rico?
Just don't ask him why any Australian would need to use his bank in the first place. The whole point of someone in Australia setting up an account in Puerto Rico is to avoid or minimise their tax, is it not?
I immediately corrected his obvious misconception about offshore banking, and I then went on to list several non-tax related legitimate reasons why someone in Australia would want to set up an account at my bank. Just don't ask Nick McKenzie to allow his audience to hear any of those answers. The problem is my answers ended up on his cutting room floor. And as a matter of fact, every person who opens up a bank account with Euro Pacific Bank, one of the questions that they have to answer is, what is the purpose of this account? Why are you opening this account, right? If it's a corporate account, what is the business purpose for this account and how do you intend to use the account? Now, they have to be able to come up with a reason that they need it, right? If they just say, well, I'm trying to hide my money, well, you're not going to get an account. Now, obviously, someone trying to hide their money, maybe they wouldn't say that. Maybe they would come up with a reason, and maybe we would approve the account. But then we monitor the account. And if the account is not being used in the manner that it was intended, we shut the account. Also, they implied that, my bank charges these enormous fees and we don't pay any interest.
You would have to question why someone would place their money in a jurisdiction that's so far away, in a bank that doesn't pay any interest, in a bank that charges enormous fees for moving your money, and in a bank that appears not to do the sorts of due diligence that many other reputable banks around the world do.
So it's like, hey, why would you put your money in a bank that charges enormous fees and doesn't pay any interest? Obviously, because they're looking the other way when it comes to tax evasion. So people are paying more money to use my bank because I help them evade their taxes. And supposedly, I'm getting rich doing it, right? That was one of the other points. They highlighted what my net worth is, that I have a lot of money, that I make a lot of money. The implication was I'm making this money running this giant scheme through Euro Pacific Bank. And I pointed out, actually, during the interview, that I have yet to make $1 from Euro Pacific Bank. I started it in 2011. I put up the capital, but I have never taken a dime in salary because I don't work at the bank, and the bank has not paid one dividend yet. So I haven't made any money at the bank. I've made money through other businesses, but I've made no money at the bank. And ironically, the main reason that I haven't made any money at the bank is because everything I make has to be reinvested in more compliance. It is crazy. We have more people working in compliance than doing anything else. And it's dramatically running up the cost of running the business, having to make all this investment in new technology, new software, all the audits, all the compliance, all these costs are not only straining the revenues of the bank, but they're making it harder. A lot of the things I wanted to do at the bank, a lot of my plans haven't even been able to be implemented because everything takes so long because I'm bogged down with so much regulation and red tape. Now, I don't like having to comply with it, but I comply with all of it. That is the problem. And of course, I'm being accused of not complying with it at all when I'm probably one of the most compliant banks out there. But getting back to why people would open up a foreign bank account, the allegation that my fees are high is just wrong. They're not high. They are normal for an offshore bank. They are higher than a traditional onshore bank, but they're not high for an offshore bank. But another aspect of my bank that they overlooked is the fact that my bank does not make any loans. It is a 100% reserve bank, right? And so if we don't make any loans and therefore don't earn any interest on our loans, how do we get our income? We get it from fees, right? And so you would think the fees would be a little higher because that's the only way we get revenue, but they're not. They're kind of normal for the offshore banking industry. But I think the fact that we don't make loans is one reason why people may want to put their money in my bank rather than an Australian bank that has a lot of risky loans and that may fail. They also highlighted the fact that I don't pay interest. Well, of course, how am I supposed to pay interest? A, I don't make any loans, but B, who pays interest? Rates are at zero. What currencies are paying interest? Most banks aren't paying interest. The difference is, at least I'll not make any loans. You have all these other banks that take your money, pay you no interest, and put it at risk by loaning it out. I'm paying you no interest, but at least I'm not loaning it out. And I give you the option of keeping your money in gold. If you prefer to have it in gold rather than a currency, I give you that option. Now, maybe that's another reason that they don't like my bank is because they don't like the fact that I focus on gold rather than fiat. But, one area where the costs of my bank are very low is foreign currency exchange fees. So if you are running a multinational business, which, most of our business customers are doing, they have money coming and going from all different jurisdictions and all different currencies. They're paying bills. They're paying employees, they're being paid. So there's money going in and out in all different currencies. And so there's lots of FX conversions going on. Our rates are very, very low, much lower than the rate that you would be charged in your typical Australian bank. So that is another reason that somebody would bank with me versus their local bank because they save a lot of money on all their foreign currency transactions. As a matter of fact, there was an Australian in particular who opened up an account at Euro Pacific Bank because he wanted to do some type of option trading strategy that we actually couldn't accommodate. And so after his money came in, we had to tell him that we couldn't do what he wanted. And, and so then he, okay, well, close my account. I want my money back, because that was the only reason I sent it in. So we sent back the money. And then he ended up losing about $4,000 or $5,000 in the process. And he demanded that the bank reimburse him. And the bank didn't do it. He eventually reached out to me and said, hey, Peter, I think this is unfair. I opened up this account at a bank and I lost all this money. You couldn't do what I thought you could do. You need to reimburse me for these losses. So I looked into how he lost money. He didn't lose any money with us. He lost money with his Australian bank. You see, he had Australian dollars in his Australian bank account, but he wired me or my bank US dollars. So the Australian company converted his Aussie dollars into US dollars and then sent the US dollars to the bank. When we sent the US dollars back to the bank, we sent out the exact number of dollars that were sent in. We didn't make any money. We sent those dollars back to his bank. His bank converted them back to Australian dollars. That's where he lost his $4,000 or $5,000. The bank had this huge fee. I mean, they charged something like 2% or some crazy fee to convert US dollars to Aussie dollars, and he did the round trip. So I said, look, we can't do anything about that. Complain to your bank. But again, I'm bringing this up because it shows you it can be very expensive to deal with a local bank. And so it's legitimate for somebody who's dealing with a lot of foreign currency transactions to want to use an offshore bank like mine, where the fees are considerably lower. Part of the irony, too, about this is, let's say somebody was in Australia and they actually wanted to have a bank account that had really good bank secrecy, and they wanted to do it in a U.S. jurisdiction. They wouldn't go to Puerto Rico. They would set up the account in Nevada. They would set it up in Delaware. Those are the jurisdictions where people go who want to hide their money from foreign governments. They don't go to Puerto Rico, right? But no, they didn't care about doing any actual factual analysis. They had already convicted me, and they were trying to present their skewed view of reality. I mean, one of the things they said, too, is that I am marketing, my gloom and doom investment strategy to the bank. But I'm not. I'm not marketing the investment services of the bank at all. I market the investment services of Euro Pacific Asset Management and Euro Pacific Capital. I don't go out and market the bank for people who are interested in my investment philosophy. The bank has some proprietary mutual funds, but I don't manage them. I have nothing to do with them. So anybody who wants me to manage their money, they don't send it to Euro Pacific Bank. They send it to Euro Pacific Asset Management or Euro Pacific Capital. Euro Pacific Bank is a bank. Now, and most of the customers who are investing in the markets, they have self-directed discount brokerage accounts that get linked to their bank accounts. So they're trading on their own investment style. They're not using mine. So I mean, everything about their story is wrong. I mean, it's hard to find even one factually accurate reference in the entire piece. Also, they seem to make a big deal that the bank had over 100 Australian clients, which I find to be ridiculous. I mean, they mentioned that we have 13,000. I forget exactly how many accounts we actually have. But even if we have a few hundred Australians, what does that mean? I mean, how many Australians are there? I mean, my bank particularly appeals to people who speak English because it's an English-speaking bank. Our website is only in English. I'm personally the most popular outside the United States in Australia, Canada, and the UK. Why am I popular in those countries? Because they speak English. All my content is in English. So the fact that we would have quite a few Australian clients, there's no red flag there. There's nothing nefarious about the fact that we have these Australian clients. I mean, there are plenty of banks that have Australian clients besides Euro Pacific Bank. One of the things that was interesting is they kept saying how easy it was for somebody to open up an account at my bank. And I kept saying, no, it's very difficult. And I actually dared the producer to try to open up an account at my bank under an assumed name or under their own name and try to give us the false impression that you're trying to evade taxes and see how far you get. In fact, I'm surprised that they didn't already try that. You would think if they were going to do some investigative journalism, they would have actually tried to open up an account. Now, I checked the records, and this guy, Nick McKenzie, didn't try to open up an account under his name because we would have seen that. But that doesn't mean he didn't use an assumed name. Maybe he did try, and we turned him down. He certainly didn't try and succeed or he would have highlighted that in his piece. In fact, when I challenged him to do some investigative journalism, he actually responded that they had tried to open up an account, but they did not. They lied. The only thing he tried to do was contact a referral agent, right? They contacted a third party that the bank doesn't employ and the bank doesn't control and the bank, doesn't supervise. The third party that they found was an Australian attorney who has actually referred some customers to the bank in the past, but he made some statements that implied that Puerto Rico possessed some special advantages that it doesn't really have.
Because it's part of America technically, but it's a tax haven insofar as you can have a bank account in Puerto Rico, and if the bank pays you interest on that bank account, there's no reporting obligations, no tax obligations in America.
And while both those statements are true, the same is also true for every single bank in every American state.
What's happened is there's been a rush of international banks setting up in Puerto Rico in the last 2 years.
Again, this is also true, but the rush he is referring to is the result of recent changes to Puerto Rican tax law that created favorable tax incentives for the owners of those banks if they also move to Puerto Rico. But the move to Puerto Rico doesn't create any special benefits for the bank's depositors. 60 Minutes is conflating the true fact that Puerto Rico is a tax haven for Americans who live there with the falsehood that Puerto Rico is also a tax haven for foreigners who bank there. And they contacted this third party, and apparently the third party told him, hey, if you're looking for a bank where you can hide money, Euro Pacific is a good bank to go to. Apparently this is what that guy said. But nobody at my bank said that. And in order for this person, let's say you go to one of these referral agents and they say, yes, Euro Pacific Capital is a good place to go if you want to avoid taxes. You still have to go to Euro Pacific Bank yourself and open up the account. And if there is any indication that that is your purpose, you ain't getting an account. And if any red flags come up after you open the account, that's what you're using the account for, the account's going to get closed. Why don't they try to open up an account? It's easy. Go online. Any reporter could go online and try to open up an account at my bank. See how far you get, right, if you're not completely honest and above board. Now, there are a lot of other false allegations. I mean, there's so many of them in their piece. One of them was that both Westpac in Australia and the Perth Mint basically fired us, decided to stop doing business with us, supposedly because, we're this bad bank and we're doing all this bad stuff, and that's why they stopped doing business with us. Both of those allegations are a lie. First of all, yes, Westpac did stop its relationship with us, I think back in 2017, 2018. But they didn't stop their relationship with my bank. They stopped their relationships with all banks in the Caribbean. So when they told us that they wanted to terminate their correspondent relation with us, they didn't say, hey, we're just getting rid of you because there's something wrong with your bank. They said that we've made a decision firm-wide that we don't want to have any correspondence in the Caribbean. So that would include all the banks there. And so that's how we lost the relationship. So it wasn't anything specific to our bank, although that is what the false impression that 60 Minutes made, was that the bank did something wrong, and so the bank was terminated. The bank never did anything wrong. In fact, it was Westpac that did something wrong. A few months ago, Westpac paid the biggest fine in Australian history, 1.3 billion Australian dollars, for something like 23 million AML violations. That's anti-money laundering. And all of those violations had to do with their corresponding banks, right? Not the bank itself, but banks like my bank that they provided corresponding services for. And these 23 million violations took place at 13 of these banks. But the interesting thing is, Euro Pacific Bank wasn't among them. So not a single one of these 23 million AML transactions were traced to my bank. How is that? We are such a bad bank. We're doing business with Westpac, and not one of the 23 million violations of AML related to my bank. Doesn't that in and of itself prove how good my bank is? how strict our compliance is. We didn't even get one out of 23 million. And as a result of this, see, Westpac got into so much trouble because of what these other 13 banks did that they decided to get out of the entire business. And we got caught up in that. Even though we did nothing wrong, we were squeaky clean. Westpac decided they didn't want to take the chance anymore. They didn't want to be in that business. So they ended our agreement. But it even wasn't a big deal. We didn't do that much business with Westpac. I mean, we did some, but it wasn't a big deal that we lost that relationship. We had other relationships. But they try to make it out like we did something really bad, overlooking the fact that it was Westpac that did something bad and that they didn't supervise those other 13 banks. They didn't do anything wrong with respect to my bank, Euro Pacific Bank, because none of the bad transactions that resulted in this $1.3 billion fine were in any way linked to Euro Pacific Bank. They also said that the Perth Mint severed their relationship with me, right? Which again is a half-truth. So the Perth Mint, unfortunately, is caught up in their own anti-money laundering investigation down in Australia. And I have a long-standing relationship at the Perth Mint. I started working with the Perth Mint in 2002 at my broker-dealer. I still am an authorized dealer for the Perth Mint, and that relationship has not been disrupted. But the Perth Mint did contact my bank and me to say that based on the AML investigation, they no longer wanted to have any omnibus accounts. And that is the type of account that my bank has, because the bank doesn't own the gold in the name of the customers. The bank owns the gold in its own name. So it has one big bank account with its gold in it. And then if customers want to have gold, then that gold becomes a liability to the customer, just like it would if they had dollars or they had euros. All those deposits sit in an account on behalf of the bank. And then on the bank's own ledger, we designate the liability of those deposits to the depositor. That's the same way we handle gold. Well, Perth Mint said we can't do that anymore. We have to have the identity of each person. We just can't say all this gold is owned by Euro Pacific Bank. So what Perth Mint said to us is that we would have to now put all the gold in each individual customer's name the way I do it at Euro Pacific Capital. Well, that wasn't going to work for our bank business model. It wasn't going to allow the gold to then be a part of the customer's bank account so that they could use it for transactions. So it defeated the whole purpose of what I was trying to do. So because of the new option that was available to me at Perth Mint, I had to choose to leave them. They didn't tell me I had to leave. They just said that if I wanted to keep doing business with them, I would have to do it a different way. Well, that way didn't work for me. So we found another company that would accommodate the omnibus account, and we were in the process of transferring all the Perth gold over there. But again, they tried to act like I was fired for doing something wrong. I wasn't fired for doing anything. I wasn't even fired, and I didn't do anything wrong. The Perth Mint has their own problems to deal with, right? They may be as innocent as me. I really don't know. I can't vouch for all of their compliance. But since I'm innocent and I'm being wrongly accused, maybe they've got the same problem. Just like Westpac. Westpac was in trouble because of what those bad banks did, and I ended up being an innocent casualty of that. I was collateral damage. I did nothing wrong, but because Westpac now had to get out of the business because of what these other banks did wrong, they no longer wanted to bank me because I'm now a higher risk because of what happened with these other banks. It's like, if an auto insurance company, let's say you have a lot of young teenage kids are getting into accidents, well, they raise the premiums for young boys. They make it really expensive. Well, what if you're a really good driver? You're a young boy. You're a great driver. You don't drink. Well, you've got to pay just as high a premium because they don't know the difference. They just have you in a broad category. So we got put in the same category as these bad banks, even though we didn't do anything bad ourselves. They also said that MasterCard turned me down for a license or turned the bank down because of our AML problems. That was a flat out lie. That never happened. MasterCard did not turn us down for any AML issues. There were no AML issues, so that had nothing to do with what happened with MasterCard. Now, what did happen with MasterCard is we did have an application to be a global issuer, and we had applied for a certain program. And at some point during the process, MasterCard decided that the program that we applied for, they were no longer going to make that available to any of the banks in the Caribbean, and they included Puerto Rico. But they did say that there was another program that they would consider us for. But the problem was that other program was way too expensive, because instead of giving us like one license for all of Europe, we were going to have to pay for each country. And given how many cards we had out there, the cost was prohibitively high. So we walked away from a MasterCard. Completely opposite of what they said. Now, of course, I still have applications pending with Visa and American Express. I mean, who knows? This may put an end to that, at least temporarily, because again, everybody is afraid to deal with me now because of these allegations, not because they're true. The problem is that there's been an allegation. And once there's an allegation, now it's a red flag. I mean, at my bank, if there was a story that came out on this 60 Minutes about somebody else, not Peter Schiff, and they made all of these unsubstantiated allegations, and that person had an account at my bank, we'd close it immediately. It doesn't matter whether the allegations are true or false. It's just once they're out there, that's the red flag. And that's what everybody is so afraid of with respect to now working with me in the financial industry, because they don't want the reputation of dealing with somebody who's been accused of money laundering, even if the only person accusing me is a media outlet in Australia. No actual government has ever accused me of anything, or my bank. But, you know, the lies and the falsehoods, it's not just the big picture stuff. They lied about everything. They lied about even the little things. Okay, so first of all, they falsely claimed that there's all these bad reviews of my bank on the internet. That's not even close to true. I mean, there are some, but the vast majority of reviews are very positive. We get a lot of positive feedback. Look at the reviews. You can go online and see them. We get great reviews on the bank. Now, the interesting thing is almost all of the negative reviews relate to the fact that either we refused to open up somebody's account or we closed somebody's account. That's what's causing people to be mad at the bank, because we closed their account or we wouldn't let them open up an account. That's not our fault. I mean, we would love to have these accounts. We are not in the business of turning accounts away. Why would we want that? In fact, all the bad reviews regarding account closures and our refusal to open accounts in and of itself disproves their central claim that we look the other way and bank anyone who applies. You know, ironically, you know, the people that are rejoicing, celebrating almost these false allegations because they want so much for them to be true is the Bitcoin community. And obviously not everybody. There are some Bitcoin crypto people that like me. Even though we disagree on Bitcoin, fundamentally we agree on a lot of things. And they respect the fact that we have a difference of opinion. And I respect them for having a difference of opinion, right? And they can see a hatchet job, right? But you have other people out there who just are rooting for my failure. They think that anything that, indicts me somehow validates Bitcoin. That if I'm a bad guy, if I'm laundering money, I'm a tax evader, that somehow that's good for Bitcoin, right? Any bad news for Peter Schiff is good news for Bitcoin. And it's not. Ironically, right? My bank, from the beginning, we have turned down every business account that applied for our bank that was in any way connected with cryptocurrency. So if we found out that their business model was either crypto or there was any crypto involved in any way, we turned down the business. Not because I didn't want the business. I would have loved that business. I want to bank as many people as I can. The reason I had to turn down just blanket denial of every crypto-related business was because cryptocurrency in and of itself is considered a red flag for money laundering. It's that people using crypto have a higher risk of potentially hiding their money, evading their taxes. It doesn't mean that everybody who's using crypto is doing that. It just means that their likelihood of doing that is greater than people who are, using euros or Australian dollars. And so because of that, we did not want that extra scrutiny. So we just turned down all those accounts. So, if I was this corrupt bank, I would have all these accounts. A lot of people in that industry wanted to bank at Euro Pacific Bank, and we turned everybody down. Hey, when you get audited, right? When you're a bank and they do the AML audit, you want as few problem accounts as possible. That's why you err on the side of caution. So if we just say, hey, we're not taking any crypto accounts, okay, then they don't have to scrutinize those accounts. If we did take some, we would get more scrutiny. Plus all of our counterparties, if they find out that you're banking crypto companies, it's like, okay, we don't want to work with you. So if we can tell our counterparties we have a blanket policy, no crypto, they feel a lot better. They're more comfortable. Because again, Westpac got into trouble because of what a correspondent bank did. So we have to look as squeaky clean as we can to other banks. Otherwise, they won't want to bank us. And we need another bank. Just like customers need to have an account with us, we need to have accounts at larger banks. And they're not going to take my business if they think it's going to expose them to a $1.3 billion fine like Westpac. That's why, if we see any bad news about any of our customers, we immediately shut their account. We don't just want to do a review and try to determine, well, the story is false, they're not really a bad guy, because then that's just more work when the auditors come in and say, oh, why didn't you fire this guy? Here, this obvious bad thing happens. How can you still have an account with this guy? We don't want to justify why we still have an account. It's much better to say, no, we fired him immediately. We closed the account. That's what we do. You're guilty. Doesn't matter. As long as there's an allegation, we assume you're guilty, right? And just close your account. That's how strict we are. Also, they claim that our new accounts are drying up. That's not true. Now, maybe that will be true in the future now that they've scared the hell out of everybody. I mean, maybe some people will close their accounts based on this article, but prior to the article and the hit job, we weren't seeing any kind of outflows at all. Now, another thing that happened too is they sent a camera crew that they hired, locals in Puerto Rico, to go down to the office of Euro Pacific Bank. Right? And so they show up unannounced. And for some reason, the security at the ground floor just let them up, which, especially with COVID going on, you would assume that they wouldn't do that. But they went all the way up to our floor. We have the entire floor of this building. And they get up and, they're in the lobby and there's glass there. And nobody lets them in, right? But they're there. And they made a big deal out of the fact that they went there to see Mark Anderson, who's the president of the bank, but that Mark refused to show his face.
Mark Anderson didn't show his face.
Well, he didn't refuse to show his face. He wasn't there. So you can't refuse to show your face if you're not even there, right? So they created the false impression that he was hiding there somewhere. He had no idea they were coming. They didn't make an appointment. He didn't find out about it until long after they had already left. So that's another misstatement. But then they, when you look at the pictures, you can see that there's a lot of empty desks. I mean, there's a few people working there, but there's a lot of empty desks. And they really made a big deal about that because they claimed, you see, the bank is just a fraud, right? Yes, they have a fancy address. They're in a high-rise building, nice view. It's the most expensive part of San Juan, right? So we're in a nice area, but that's all part of the fraud, right? Because we don't really have a real bank. It's all for show, right? Well, it's COVID-19. There are normally a lot more people sitting at those desks, but they're working from home. Just like people in all companies all over the world are working from home. What is so suspicious about that? They have to know that. They know COVID-19 is going on, yet they're trying to pretend that the reason those desks are empty is because nobody works there and nobody's doing compliance. There are a lot of people that work there, and in fact, we have a lot of people in offices in St. Vincent's, where we used to be, and we have a lot of people working in Anguilla. We have a lot of operational compliance work that is being done outside of Puerto Rico because they're still there from before we moved to Puerto Rico. Now we're hiring more people in Puerto Rico, and we probably would have already hired a lot more people if it wasn't for some of the projects that we want that would require more people. They are on the back burner now because we have so many other regulatory things that we're dealing with in order to move progress. We're waiting on certain approvals that we need before we can do some of the things that we want. And the approvals take forever. Not because we've done anything wrong. It's just that's how slowly the wheels of regulation turn. And obviously COVID is making it all worse because everybody is doing less work now. Everything is bogged down because a lot of the work that we're waiting on to be done by government officials isn't being done. But under normal circumstances, that office would be full. But they tried to create the false impression that a bunch of empty desks meant that it was a sham operation. They also brought up a ridiculous allegation. They said, also, we heard that Euro Pacific Bank is no longer providing coffee and snacks. Now, first of all, I don't know where they heard that, or I don't even know how that's relevant. Somehow, if we weren't providing as much coffee and snacks, that means the bank is going down. I mean, how much does coffee cost? How much are snacks? I mean, the fact that they want to focus on something like whether or not we're giving our workers snacks shows you that they have absolutely no real substance behind this fiction of a story. Now, there's also these crazy allegations about Mark Anderson's computer being hacked. That never happened. In fact, I think they alleged it was hacked on multiple occasions. No information was stolen from Mark's computer. Now, there was a reference to a Bitcoin ransom, right? At one point years ago, somebody did a routine denial of service attack against the bank and demanded 1,000 Bitcoin in ransom to call it off, which I guess, is worth about $1 million, right? And we never paid the ransom. We hired outside consultants and we solved the problem ourselves. And none of the bank's information was compromised. It cost us money, but we didn't pay the blackmail, and it didn't cost anywhere near $1 million. But a lot of people are now saying that that's why I don't like Bitcoin, because I was blackmailed for Bitcoin. That's got nothing to do with it, right? The Bitcoiners have to stop trying to make this story about Bitcoin. It's got nothing to do with Bitcoin. It's got nothing to do with my integrity. It's about the lack of integrity of the news organization that's pretending to be a news organization that's really trying to advance a political agenda, and they're pretending to reporting the news, but they're reporting pure fiction, and all the fiction is one lie after another with nothing substantiated. In fact, they know they're lying. There's no way they cannot know that they're being dishonest. This is not just a mistake where these guys have just gotten it wrong. They know they have it wrong, and they're lying about it anyway. In fact, I think that maybe when they first started the interviewing process and started their investigation a month or two ago, maybe they legitimately thought they had something. But when they found out they had nothing after spending all this time and money, they just decided to go ahead with the story anyway, because they'd already invested so much time and money in it. They didn't want to walk away. I mean, there's no story in completely innocent bank guilty of nothing. So in order to have a story that would be sensational, since they didn't have a real story, they decided to make one up. Now, the smoking gun, right, that they supposedly introduced was this ex-employee, right, that spilled the beans and told them, what bad guys we are, right? All right, well, they dug up this guy, John Ogilvy, right, who was an independent contractor for the bank for IT. So the guy never even visited the bank. He was Canadian. I think he spent most of his time in China. So he did all of his work remotely. So whatever impressions he had of the bank, he garnered those impressions without actually being in the bank, right? So he worked for the bank for 2 or 3 years. He was fired. He did not resign. He was fired. Now, after he was fired, he sent me an email. And they mentioned that in the Age story, that the final thing he did was to send an email to Peter Schiff, and that email warned that the chickens would come home to roost at Euro Pacific. And during the interview, they said, well, does it surprise you that these guys are the center of a major tax evasion, money laundering scheme? And he goes, no, it doesn't surprise me at all. I knew these guys were bad guys. I knew they were breaking the law. I knew they would get in trouble. They were very shady, right? He's saying all this. Although who knows, again, they might have edited some of his stuff. But the stuff that they showed looked pretty bad.
Are you surprised that the bank's now at the center of an international tax evasion probe?
I'm not surprised, no. These are unscrupulous people.
And he said, their business model is to market to tax avoiders, which of course is completely wrong.
It's marketed to keep your money away from the tax authorities.
In fact, the lie that Euro Pacific Bank specifically markets its services to tax evaders was used repeatedly throughout the broadcast, almost as if the line had been scripted.
It was fairly apparent that Peter Schiff was operating in a manner that was intended to attract customers who were looking to either evade tax or perhaps launder money.
That's not our business model at all. There's no evidence that's our business model. In fact, it's the opposite of our business model. So he said all this stuff about how we were bad guys, and it doesn't surprise him considering how dishonest everybody was. Right. So I reread the email that he sent me, and it was a long email. I mean, this thing is like 2 pages long. And when he sends me the email, he introduces himself and says, "Hey, Mr. Schiff, I've been working for your bank for all this time, and I got fired. And, I just want to let you know my thoughts about some of the problems at the bank that I think you should fix," right? Because he actually thinks that there's a lot of potential at my bank, a lot of untapped potential. He thinks the bank could be a lot more valuable to me if I had better people running it. So he specifically had a lot of criticisms for Mark Anderson, who is the president and the vice president of the bank, right, who isn't mentioned in any of these articles. But anyway, there was a lot of criticism about them. But none of the criticism in that email related to their honesty or their integrity. Nothing in the email suggested that he was suspicious that there was any organized effort to help people avoid taxes or launder money. He didn't raise one concern about our AML or any other compliance procedures. All of the criticism in that email was on the competence of those two officers, the president and the vice president, to run the bank. He didn't think they had enough banking experience and that they didn't really know what they were doing. What he thought was that I should bring on some more seasoned banking professionals, or maybe even take a more active role myself. He specifically wrote in his email to me, "I'm not suggesting that you fire any people, right? Don't fire Mark Anderson. Just give him a different role. He's just not suited to be president. Bring in a new president." Well, if he's such a bad guy, which is what he said in the 60 Minutes, if he's dishonest and he's a crook, why would he tell me not to fire him? Why would you say fire the guy? He's dishonest. He's a crook. If he had any concerns about money laundering, why didn't he raise them in that letter? Because the implication is that he was fired over the dispute that he had with management that resulted from his objecting to all of the bad things that management was supposedly doing. But he didn't see them because he didn't point them out. And if he saw bad things happening, why didn't he say anything until after he was fired? The truth of the matter is, he is a disgruntled former employee, independent contractor really, not even an employee, whose contract was terminated. And he had an axe to grind. It's clear, I read the email, he does not like Mark Anderson or the vice president. That was clear. So now he's taking an opportunity to get some revenge, and 60 Minutes Australia exploited him and used him in order to help him get revenge at my expense. Also, they make a big deal out of the fact that at some time in early 2019, the Australian government put my bank's name on this list, Australian Priority Organisation Target, supposedly meaning that my bank represents a greater threat than, I don't know, your typical bank, or I don't even know, your typical entity, because I looked online to see if I can actually find this list and to see who else is on it in addition to my bank, and I couldn't find anything that showed the actual list. I did find some references to the list itself and what it purportedly means, but I couldn't find the actual entities that are on the list. So it'd be interesting how many other banks are on this list, and why is my bank the only one that was the subject of this piece? I mean, the piece was not about offshore banking in general. It was about my bank in particular. So why are they ignoring all the other banks that may be on that list and solely focusing on my bank? I mean, these people that supposedly had accounts at Euro Pacific, right? Many of them did not. Many of the accounts were closed in the past. Some of them probably still did. But how many other banks did they have accounts at? And why are those banks not being targeted? Why is the only bank that they're concerned about my bank, when there's no way that the only accounts that these individuals had were accounts at my bank, when a lot of these accounts had already been closed? So by definition, if they had an account with me at one time and now it's closed, wouldn't these same people have opened up an account someplace else? Why isn't that mentioned? Why aren't they investigating those banks? Why are all of their efforts focused on my bank, despite the fact that there isn't a shred of evidence that suggests that anything wrong is actually going on at my bank? You know, the bottom line on this whole thing, I haven't seen anything like this since the hatchet job that The Daily Show did on me. And if you don't recall that, that was when they invited me on with Samantha Bee, and they spent 4 hours interviewing me on the minimum wage, and then basically condensed those 4 hours into 4 highly edited minutes of taking me out of context and trying to make me look really bad. And that angered me. And, you know, I considered trying to sue them, but there was a lot of problems with the lawsuit there because, you know, they're kind of a comedy show. I had signed a release, and it was kind of my mistake for trusting these guys. In fact, just like with 60 Minutes Australia, to fraudulently induce me to agree to do the interview, The Daily Show sent me an email assuring me that they would never take anything I said out of context or try to make me look bad, which is exactly what they intended to do and exactly what they did do. And the thing that bothered me is after their piece came out, it wasn't the Daily Show comedy skit, but the fact that so many other news organizations actually reported on what I said as if it was real news, which of course it wasn't. And, you know, I demanded that The Daily Show release the unedited footage. They never did. I contacted some lawyers, and they really said, look, this is a difficult case. So I walked away from it. This is a totally different situation with Fairfax Media, right? This is not a comedy show. They purport to be legitimate news, right? Yet they have resorted to the same lowbrow tactics as The Daily Show. They have taken an hour interview and sliced and diced it and taken me out of context, and they lied. Just like The Daily Show didn't tell me that the purpose was a hit job on me, they wanted to discuss the minimum wage. These guys lied to me and pretended they wanted to discuss the economy when really they were laying a trap to ambush me with all these false allegations and try to make me look as bad as possible, and then take selective pieces of this footage that they could use to show me in the most sinister light possible. You know, part of the problem is they disable the comments on their YouTube video, which is generally the first sign that, you know, you've done something wrong, because you don't want people to comment on how bad the subject matter is. So they disable the comments, so somebody like me or anybody else, you know, prevents you from going on there and pointing out any of the falsehoods that I'm bringing up right now. But what I would suggest is that everybody who sees my official video reply, share it with as many people as possible. I want to make sure that a lot more people see this video than watch that 60 Minutes story or read that article in The Age. I mean, it's not even like a newspaper, right? They shouldn't even be dignified. These are like tabloids, right? This is all lies. These are trash. I mean, hopefully, after I finish suing these guys, if they don't apologize right away, I'd like to put them out of business. They shouldn't be allowed to do this to other people, right? So they have no business being in the profession of journalism. Nobody should watch these programs or read these papers and be under the impression that they're getting anything close to the news, right? So hopefully I can completely destroy any credibility they may have had in Australia for being honest, right? And being a source of news. So maybe I can do a public service to Australia by ridding the nation of this menace. In fact, I've got a feeling that the real agenda is to use these false allegations against Euro Pacific Bank as a springboard for enhanced anti-money laundering regulations, both on Australian banks, but also to expand the existing AML regulations to also include Australian lawyers and accountants and other professionals. After all, these guys were caught working with Euro Pacific Bank. I mean, perhaps the reporters on this story were actually secretly working with government officials to coordinate the release of this story with that proposed legislation. In fact, I think the intent was to drum up outrage and support for this new regulations. This might actually explain why these reporters were so insistent on going forward with the story, even though it proved to obviously be false. It's because they needed me to be the poster boy in this political campaign. And destroying my reputation, well, that was just acceptable collateral damage. Basically, I was just a pawn that was sacrificed in a political chess game. But the biggest losers in this game will be the Australian people, who will be duped by fake news into accepting greater government control and regulation and into giving up more of their individual freedoms and liberties. And I want to let everybody know as well that I do appreciate all the support that I've already been given by people who have seen this hatchet job on their own and have seen through it and knew exactly what it was. And there's a lot of people, including some of the Bitcoin people, as I said earlier, that have come to my defense, that have defended me in public, that have sent favorable emails of support, that have put favorable comments up there. And so I really appreciate the fact that a lot of people are standing by me at this time. But now you have a lot of ammunition. Now that you actually know the facts and you see how I was fraudulently induced into agreeing to this interview and how they are hiding most of the interview from the public because they don't want the public to know how much they had to slice and dice this thing. And I don't even look that bad, but you can imagine how bad they look if you actually could see the entire thing, right? But now that I have exposed so many of the lies, right, so much of the fraud that went into developing this whole fiction of a story, now you've got a lot more ammunition. Now it's not just my word against their word. Now you can actually see all the evidence for yourself to know how everything was taken out of context, how they deliberately misrepresented facts and distorted things and told half-truths or no truths at all. So help me disseminate this information and try to mitigate the damages, because there are going to be real damages that I am going to suffer. I am already suffering them. Not so much because my clients are abandoning me. I think the vast majority of my clients will stick with me. It's possible I could lose some. I don't know. What I'm not worried about is my customers. I am worried about other people in the financial industry that I depend on to do business. I need counterparties to work with me. I can't be in the brokerage industry. I can't be in the asset management industry. I can't be in the mutual fund industry. I can't be in the gold industry. I can't be in banking if nobody will do business with me. If there is now a stigma associated with my name, then anybody who has any business relations with me is tainted, by that same brush. So everybody has to distance themselves from me. And in a way, I can't blame them, because I would do the same thing if I was in their position, because I've done the same thing. Everybody is forced to make these decisions because the regulators give you no choice. And yes, am I a major critic of these regulations? Absolutely. But does that mean I ignore them? No. I abide by all the rules and regulations that I think are unconstitutional and that I think shouldn't exist and that I think are bad economics. I don't like the laws, I don't like the regulations, but I abide by them anyway. Am I a critic of the income tax? Absolutely, right? Do I wish the income tax would be repealed, not only in America, but in every country around the world, including Australia? Absolutely. But do I pay all the taxes that I'm legally obligated to pay? 100%. What is my advice to other people? Do I advocate that other people don't comply with their tax laws? Quite the opposite. I urge people to comply with their tax laws. I make compliance with your tax laws a condition of opening up an account with a bank. As I said, you have to certify that you're compliant to get an account. And if you don't prove that you're compliant, you're not going to keep your account. So nothing about this story is real. It is all a hit job on me. They're trying to take me down because they don't like my politics. And I think also maybe they're trying to drive some fear into local Australians. Their tax filing deadlines are coming up. They want to make people think that the government is honing in on them and coming down on them, and maybe force some people who might be underreporting their income to fully report their income. And they're trying to use me as a way to generate more compliance with their own local tax laws. whoever knows what their hidden agenda is, we know that the one thing that is not on their agenda is the truth. They couldn't give a damn about the truth. That is the biggest casualty in all of this. And of course, I am a casualty, my reputation, my livelihood, and the reputations and livelihoods of people who are associated with me, other people who are partners of mine in my business enterprises, people who are my employees, who work for me, are now having a problem, all because of these false, unsubstantiated lies that are being deliberately put out there by an organization that is purporting to be newsworthy. See, that is why these allegations have credibility, because no one believes that they would just make this stuff up. Who would believe it? I wouldn't believe it myself unless I was seeing it with my own eyes. You would think that a news company that not only has no evidence that their story is correct, but all the evidence that they do have proves that their story is false, that they would ignore all the evidence that proves the story is false and just move forward with the story anyway and pretend that it's true. But that is exactly what's happening. I'm living in some kind of twilight zone, right? And I'm hoping to come back to reality. And so thanks everybody for listening to my side of the story. Hopefully this thing has a swift resolution, but you can help me by disseminating this information to as many people as possible, and maybe send demands to 60 Minutes Australia. Demand that they release the full unedited interview that they fraudulently induced me to agree to. Would I have invited them into my home where I live if they had told me what the purpose of the interview was? Of course not. They took advantage of my hospitality. Were they paying me for that interview? No, they weren't paying me anything. I was helping them because they wanted to talk about inflation and gold, and these are topics that I care about. I wanted to help spread the word, and I didn't require any compensation. I did it out of the goodness of my heart. I did it because I thought it was the right thing to do, and they exploited that. They took advantage of that to try to make a name for themselves or further their own reputation at my expense. Well, hopefully they lose what's left of that of their reputation, because they have screwed over the wrong guy. I am not going to take this lying down. I am going to spend whatever it takes to bring these criminals to justice.